Hello friends, I'm Yube, and today I'm going to be talking a little about a game I love that a lot of people don't, and answering a simple question: why is Darkest Dungeon so difficult? To avoid accusations of clickbait, here's your answer right here, because
overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer.
Seriously, that's it. Also this one.
You cannot learn a thing you think you know.
There you go, you can turn off now. The algorithm won't mind. But this video is a look at the brilliant design of Darkest Dungeon, why it gets so much stick for being difficult, and how it uses your own expectations and biases against you. So this isn't a guide, it's not going to show you the one simple trick to beating Darkest Dungeon or anything like that, although it might put you in the right mindset to persevere with the game.
Failure tests the mettle of heart, brain, and body.
After all, there will be spoilers throughout as well, so go finish the game first, it's excellent. So Darkest Dungeon, at first glance, appears to be a pretty straightforward dungeon crawler with roguelike elements. You run pseudo-randomly generated dungeons, get loot, level up, and when you're strong enough, kill boss, save world, win game, roll credits. But it's not quite that simple. Darkest Dungeon leans so heavily on the fourth wall that it's almost a deconstruction of the genre, and also actually is exactly that. But before we get into that, first let's look at what we mean by the term dungeon crawler. I mean, I bet you know one when you see it, but there's really no perfect definition. Throughout this video, I'm going to be defining dungeon crawler as follows. A game centered on a gameplay loop of killing things to get levels and or equipment to facilitate killing more powerful things. This definition is broad enough to encompass a lot of different games. Action RPGs like Path of Exile and Diablo, most MMOs, World of Warcraft fits this definition perfectly, for example. And even some oddball games like 10 Million, which is a dungeon crawler take on a match 3 game that I highly recommend. So that probably wasn't quite the same definition you would have come up with, but it's very likely to be very close. All pieces of art, novels, films, video games, rest on a set of axioms, the common elements crucial to the definition. An axiom of video games, for example, is player control. You can't make a video game that doesn't accept any inputs, because that's not a video game. You can't write a novel that doesn't have a narrative, because what you come out with isn't going to be a novel. You can't write a song that doesn't have vocals, that's a piece, not a song. Genres have their own axioms too. If you're not shooting things in first person, you're not playing a first person shooter. Modern dungeon crawlers need a powerful and or heroic protagonist, the accumulation of resources, a way to gain levels and innate power, usually along multiple axes. Darkest Dungeon knows you expect these things, and it uses that expectation against you. Look at this artwork. The quality is breathtaking, but the style is the point. Stark contrast between black and red, sheer edges and sharp corners. Looks like it'd really hurt if you fell into this picture. So this is a difficult game for hardcore gamers only, and yeah, Darkest Dungeon is one of the few games in which you may reasonably fail the tutorial, which is part of your permanent progress, setting yourself up for a rough start to the game. Understandably, this annoys some people who see it as evidence of poor design, a focus on randomness, or straight up sadism or cruelty on the part of the developers. And it very deliberately reinforces the idea that the creators wanted to appeal solely to people who pride themselves on beating difficult games. Animal Crossing it ain't, lads, this game is extremely poggers. The first time, interestingly, every single time you load up Darkest Dungeon, you'll see this screen. Quests will fail, heroes will die, and when they die, they stay dead. It's easy to just kind of ignore though, isn't it? At least after the first time you see it. Everything you've seen so far suggests the game is trying too hard to impress. This game wants you to underestimate it while also giving you all the tools you need to succeed. Darkest Dungeon will never lie to you, but you will never trust it. Far too many people read this message or click hurriedly past it, and still get attached to specific adventurers expecting everyone to survive everything, just like in more traditional games. Look at this trapped bandit stash. It's telling you it's trapped, and it is. And this altar. Place a torch here if you crave the void. You crave the void? Dude walks up to you on the street and says, "Hey man, follow me through the gate to ruin, I've got some void for you." You take it? This game is honest to a fault. These days we expect games, especially dungeon crawlers, to be forgiving, and even when they tell us otherwise, we don't believe them. We expect them to consistently reward good play with incremental progress, perhaps with brief windfalls to keep us hooked. maybe most importantly, we expect our heroes to be stalwart protectors, slaying the forces of evil without a care in the world. Darkest Dungeon knows we expect that and refuses to give it to us. Please don't get me wrong, the small team at Red Hook don't dislike or disdain modern games. I wouldn't want to misrepresent that. In fact, here's what the fantastic Chris Bourassa had to say about Darkest Dungeon's inception in a 2015 interview. The full text is linked in the description. I play MMOs from time to time, the gear progression's really important in them type of games. So I was just kind of joking. Wouldn't really matter how big my shoulder pads were. If I was underground fighting skeletons, I'd be shit scared. And we were chuckling about that and then kind of stopped laughing and were like, well, why don't RPGs ever talk about the sword arm and not the sword? In another interview, he goes a little deeper into this subject, and again the full text is linked below. The game's concept began as an observation that RPGs generally tend to view adventuring through a very romanticised lens. Heroes are immutable, aspirational, and all-powerful, but heroes, real ones, are human. They're flawed, nuanced, and capable of failure. In fact, it is these flaws that allow true heroism to shine. They accentuate heroic acts by virtue of contrast. I'd apologise for the accent, but I'm not sorry. So Darkest Dungeon began as an exploration of what traversing ancient ruins and fighting eldritch abominations would really do to a person, because anyone who wouldn't experience terror, pain, or regret in those circumstances ceases to be a relatable character. The faceless Superman protagonist of Diablo 3 never balks at slaying wolves or zombies or archdemons, but if Diablo 3 were a film, and please let's never let that happen, that would be roundly derided as unrealistic, even within the context of the setting. So that's the space that Red Hook wanted to explore, I think. The space usually glossed over by the heroic self-insert protagonist axiom of dungeon crawlers. The psychological damage that an adventurer's job would doubtless inflict upon them. At the risk of sounding overly pretentious, I believe this is the darkest dungeon of the title, not just the location in-game, but the unexplored space that other major games and their players don't want to acknowledge. This is why I try to avoid using the H word when I talk about Darkest Dungeon's adventurers. It dehumanizes them. They're not traditional heroes. They're selfish, desperate, and greedy. How many truly inspirational heroes fit this definition? Walter White? Tony Soprano? Earlier we said Darkest Dungeon leaned on the fourth wall. Just quickly, what does that mean? If you're not familiar with the term fourth wall, think of the way we see a house laid out before us in a TV show. We can see 3 of the 4 walls, the fourth one is between us, the viewer, and the false reality of the show. Darkest Dungeon reaches right through the fourth wall and pulls you into the game itself. At this point, you might be entertaining the idea that you, the player, are part of the story. Not one of the characters in Darkest Dungeon has the best interests of the hamlet at heart. Not the ancestor, who is only concerned with his own legacy and how he will be remembered. Not the adventurers themselves, who all have their own selfish reasons for being in the hamlet. Not the player character, whose only motive is to restore his family's honour at any cost, and not even you, the player, whose only mission is to beat the game with little regard for the in-universe consequences. This is one of the ways in which Darkest Dungeon gets into the player's head. We are part of the game's story. In our adventurers, we see ourselves. As they become stressed and paranoid and unstable because they're fighting eldritch abominations, they start making bad decisions, and we feel our own heart rate rise, our own muscles tense, because their bad decisions mean we might lose the game, and then we start making bad decisions. We're not the ones facing the pelagic dread or the cannibalistic swine, but even though our stakes are lower, we know that one nasty crit or one low-rolled heal could mean we lose someone, and that might mean we have to retreat or run the risk of losing even more. And when our characters are overcome by madness, more and more of the player's agency and control is removed by the game. When the torch runs black, who knows what might be lurking in the shadows. As Bourassa said about the characters' human flaws, they accentuate heroic acts by virtue of contrast. This is another direct parallel between the player and the characters they control. I believe that Bourassa isn't just talking about the characters' efforts to overcome the odds, but the players too. And it's worth mentioning here that perfect play is absolutely rewarded in Darkest Dungeon, and a brilliant and intimate knowledge of the game's mechanics does in fact make the game very consistently winnable. YouTube is full of deathless runs through the entire game, but most players will never get anywhere close to that, myself included. If the game were easy, finishing it would just be a nice way to spend an afternoon. You'd play it, enjoy it, and forget about it the following day. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but that's not the game Red Hook wanted to create. It's why this game still has an overwhelming fan base 6 years after its official release, and why there's so much excitement about the upcoming sequel. Remember,
where there is no peril in the task, there can be no glory in its accomplishment.
I hope Darkest Dungeon 2 is everything that made the first game unique and beloved. Games that try to cater to everyone end up being indistinguishable from each other and soon forgotten. I will not forget Darkest Dungeon for a very long time. So thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more, I stream pretty sporadically over on Twitch, link in the description, where I talk a lot about this kind of thing while thoroughly failing to exhibit any kind of actual skill at the game. So until next time, I'll see you in the future, and maybe the past.